All right, and we are still here for Sitrep PH at the Manila Dialogue on the South China Sea. And with us, we're proud to have with us our good friend Ray Powell. He is currently the director of the Sea Light Gordian Knot Center at the National Security Innovation Center at Stanford University. Ray, how has your conference been so far?
It's been a lot of fun. Actually, I think this is really well done. I actually applaud the Pacific Forum and Jeffrey Ordaniel and Jay Terriella for putting this on. I think it's been really useful.
I guess we need to start off with your little presentation, with your presentation earlier in the panel, the first panel for the day, discussing the risks to the South China Sea. You characterized China as an imperialist occupying power, and this generated a little bit of buzz on Twitter. Well, why would you say such a thing? For example, what makes you characterize China as an occupying and hostile imperialist power?
So I think there's a couple of reasons. One is that I note that some of the other claimant states, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, sometimes we see them sort of wag their finger at the Philippines and say, you're provoking China, you're complicating the situation, you're hyping the situation. And I'm trying to make the point that the Philippine situation is very different from them. And they do not have a military base in their exclusive economic zone, a Chinese military base. They don't have their access to major shoals like Sabina Shoal, Scarborough Shoal, Sakatama Shoal restricted by a hostile power. And what China wants as an occupier, and again, the idea of a maritime occupation is kind of new, but I think you have to look at it that way. Their presence in the West Philippine Sea is so overwhelming that it's clear that what they're trying to do is subdue all resistance. And so that brings us to the other point, which is the Philippines is going to have to start looking at this security problem, not as responding to this incursion or that incident, but this is a long-term nonviolent resistance against an occupying force.
You mentioned that it will be a long-term insurgency. That's the term you use. How do you see this playing out in the next few decades in your mind? How would such an insurgency look like, and what are the chances of the Philippines actually succeeding? You compared it to Gandhi and the Free India movement, for example. Is it really the same, and what are the chances of succeeding?
Well, there's no such thing as a perfect analogy, and this is kind of an unprecedented situation as with the maritime occupation. But I drew the analogy with Gandhi because the Philippines has chosen the way of nonviolence. And so if you're going to do that as a resistance, you have to use other tools. And so legal tools like the arbitral tribunal, of course, is one of them. And there are a number of other legal avenues that the Philippines could pursue. Informational tools like the Transparency Initiative is another way to do it. I think that's been extremely successful in showing China to be an occupying force. And the diplomatic tools, economic tools. So it has to look at this as a long-term resistance campaign and then build a strategy around that. The Transparency Initiative becomes one tactic in the tool bag in that long-term strategy.
You basically characterize a lot of the rhetoric coming from ASEAN right now as victim blaming. You're asking a lot of the ASEAN states and their representatives to put themselves in the shoes of the Filipinos, which is facing a unique security situation unlike others. Why do you think there's a muted response from many of our ASEAN neighbors? Because there's a lot of consternation here in Manila, especially from some circles, that we seem to be the odd one out in ASEAN when it comes to having a more how should we say, assertive response in the face of Chinese incursions. You don't see this from Indonesia, for example.
Right, and that's why I made the point about the occupation, because Indonesia doesn't face an occupation; they face incursions, right? And so it's a different situation. So Indonesia and Malaysia, for example, respond as people who have a less acute problem than the Philippines has. They are not facing down an occupation. And so when they say those things, when they say, why are you provoking? I mean, I saw one of my colleagues, Filipino colleagues, get pretty animated at a discussion yesterday at lunch when these things came up, and very disappointed in the language of one of the ASEAN members for basically doing just that. And just a lot of frustration is you other ASEAN countries are not understanding our situation, and you're not looking at this through our eyes. And so, I mean, the basic answer to your question is they're doing because they think it's in their national interest to be quiet. But like I like to point out is that it's not you now, but when it is you, who's going to speak up for you?
Right. And a lot of these statements were basically repeated. A lot of these gaslightings and a lot of this downplaying was repeated by one of your fellow co-panelists, Bo Howe from the South China Sea Probing Initiative. He characterized a lot of the maritime actions of China as merely being security measures, guarding the border, etc., despite it completely breaching international norms. And he again stated he heeded the Philippines uh, to heed the wisdom of its fellow ASEAN states. How would you react to such statements, especially the fact that they seem to be completely unaware or not uncaring of Philippine sentiments?
Well, I mean, his statements make perfect sense if you're an occupier, right? An occupation force wants you to be quiet, submit to their version of peace and stability under their authority. So it makes perfect sense in his framework. They are trying to subdue the inhabitants of the land, as you will, and so subdue means be quiet.
Absolutely. And moving on, what do you think is the significance of holding such a conference right now in Manila? Why do you think there's a big attention suddenly being focused? Well, we wouldn't say suddenly, but slowly being focused on Manila. What makes the Philippines the flashpoint in the region?
Well, again, this is where the problem is most acute, and of course, the Philippines made a decision to tell the world, and now the world knows. I mean, the Philippines has told the world through pictures, through video, through reports. So the Transparency Initiative is what has brought this home to the rest of the world, and has put China on the defensive, which is a good thing.
And you talked about the recent Transparency Initiative of President Marcos. How is this a comparison or a contrast between what we were seeing in the Duterte era just about 3 or 4 years ago?
Oh, sure. I mean, so the Philippines tried something. They tried to see if they could kind of win China over through a more agreeable foreign policy, which meant acquiescing to China's demands not to make a big deal out of the fact that, for example, we shine a laser on your boat or we run over your fishing boats, and to basically submit to China's authority. And in the end, the Philippines didn't really get very much from it. And what President Marcos came in after a period of time where he seemed to assess the situation. I think what he realized was that if the Philippines doesn't take a stand somewhere, eventually it will all simply be gone. And the Philippines will have gone quietly into the night and be under, the West Philippine Sea will be under total Chinese subjugation. And so he decided to make a stand.
Frankly speaking, how do you judge current Philippine foreign policy? Do you think it's achieving its objectives, or is it too early, considering you said will be a long-term "quote unquote" insurgency?
Yeah. So the Philippines has decided to take on some risk by doing this, right? But that's what leadership is. The Philippines has shown, I think, extraordinary leadership and has employed a really novel tactic. Assertive transparency, as I pointed out in my writings, is something new in the world. We've seen reactive transparency before. We've seen, limited transparency, but going out and saying, the best way to fight back against a determined gray zone operation is to turn on the lights in the gray zone.
What did you mean by that? Assertive transparency versus quiet transparency. Perhaps you can draw a sharper contrast.
Well, so I often talk about reactive transparency. So, for example, the very first incident in which the Philippines showed the pictures, I go all the way back to February of 2023, and that was the laser incident, where the Malapascua a laser was shown on it by a Chinese Coast Guard ship. And the Philippine government took about a week to decide what it wanted to do about that. But in the end, put out the pictures and the video. And that was a reaction to the incident. But what it did next was the assertive part. It actually went out and found the other incidents that were going on continuously. The vessel swarms off of Pagasa, all the fishing boats all over Iroquois Reef. All of these things were assertively the Philippines assertively shone the light on those, brought out embedded reporters to all of these places so that they could show the world. That was not an incident in those cases to react to, but instead it was an assertion by the Philippines to show the Philippine people and the world what was going on.
And perhaps we can wrap up this discussion by talking about the alliance in the last few questions. You have Ambassador Carlson over there reaffirming the U.S. commitment to the U.S. Philippine alliance in securing Philippine sovereignty in the South China Sea. How do you see this relationship moving forward, especially with the Republicans gaining control in Washington across all branches? I know you worked previously in the Trump administration, so perhaps you can give us some insight in what a Trump administration would look like in the face of Chinese aggression.
Sure. And just to clarify, I was not a political appointee within the Trump
Yes,
administration. I was a
yes.
military officer serving during the Trump administration and in the U.S. embassy. So, and that was in Australia. So, I mean, it's a different kind of vibe, if you will, in the Trump administration. And President Trump will certainly say a lot of things that are get a lot of attention. And I know that we tried not to react to every single thing he said because every single thing he says doesn't necessarily mean something's going to happen. But what we did see during the first Trump administration was the first really strong reaffirmation or affirmation of the U.S. commitment to the Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty into the West Philippine Sea by then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo.
Yes.
So it's not so. I mean, my anticipation is that we'll see a continuity of the current policies, perhaps a more muscular approach to China in many ways. So that's what I believe we'll see. Now we're all going to wait and see whom he decides to appoint to his key posts. Like if it's people in the same vein as Secretary of State Pompeo, then we've already been we've seen that before. We know what to expect. If it's new people or if it's other people, we'll have to look at how they look at the world, and that will give us clues as to how President Trump looks at the world. But for the most part, the people who have surrounded President Trump have been pretty strong on China.
The first Trump administration was characterized by it overlapping with the Duterte admin, which was more focused on finding a diplomatic consensus with China. How do you think it will jive now, the second Trump administration, with a Marcos sitting in power?
Well, as I understand it, President Trump and President Marcos actually share some personal history. So President Marcos actually may have some opportunities to kind of make inroads with President Trump because personal diplomacy with President Trump does actually count for quite a bit. So I think I think we can look forward to some positive interactions between the two of them. That's I think the most that we can speculate for now.
And lastly, some personal questions. You've become really one of the main faces in the South China Sea initiative here in the Philippines, especially when it comes to transparency, drawing a lot of love and also a lot of hate and criticism from certain quarters. How does it feel to suddenly be in the center of media attention in this country?
Well, I mean, it's got its ups and downs. As far as the negative attention, I don't worry about it too much. Actually, I kind of have fun with it a little bit. It's to me, it's kind of harmless, and it sort of indicates that maybe I'm on the right track because some of the lines that come out are basically lines that come straight out of Beijing. And so if I'm not gaining a fan club in Beijing, then I guess that's working out okay.
All right, our good friend Ray Powell, thank you for speaking to Sitrep PH.
All right.